be quiet. You have a long introduction before your work. And I say to you...
You cue me.
Okay.
Our tonight is so scared of us that he does not come alone, but called in 2 bodyguards, which is kind of scary to us. Anyway, you know, the students from first year don't know him, but will next year. Philosopher of a very special kind we have tonight. Especially is one of the kind who is defined by who he escaped from. Got involved and escaped from. I'm not talking about politics, even in philosophy. There was the great masters like Lacan and Deleuze. He got so close that he easily could have become one of them, then a disciple. But no, he took something out and took it and ran, and found his own way to do things. And helpful for that was always a guy not very much cherished nowadays called Plato. If you all know him, the father, whatever, of Western metaphysics, and therefore we try to stay away from him. But our philosopher tonight is taught us not to do that. So, and when I ask him what kind of philosopher he would like to be named, I think is a word for that, and said, why not Plato, professor? He said, no, give me Descartes. So the Descartes professor of EGS, Alain, Badiou.
The title of my lecture is Desctruction, Negation, and Subtraction. During my lecture, I propose to read and to interpret a fragment of the Italian poet Pier Paolo Pasolini. With me, we can see Avital Ronald and Doré Michelout. They have, you know that, a profound and creative relationship to literature and poetry. Doré Michelout will read the original Italian version of the poem of Pasolini. I shall read the French translation, and Avital Ronel will read the English translation. Thank you very much for your precious participation in the lecture of this evening. The abstract contents of my lecture is a very simple one. I can summarize it in some points. All creations, all novelties are in some sense the affirmative part of a negation. I say negation because if something happens as new, it cannot be reduced to the objectivity of the situation where it happens. So, it is certainly like a negative exception to the regular laws of this objectivity. But I say affirmation, affirmative part of the negation, because if a creation is reducible to a negation of the common laws of objectivity, it completely depends on them concerning its identity. So the very essence of a novelty implies negation, but must affirm its identity apart of the negativity of negation. That is why I say that a creation or a novelty must be defined, paradoxically, as an affirmative part of negation. I name destruction the negative part of negation. For example, if we consider the creation by Schoenberg at the beginning of the last century of the dodecaphonic musical system, we can say that this creation achieves the destruction of the tonal system, which in the Western world has dominated the musical creation during 3 centuries. In the same direction, the Marxist idea of revolution is to achieve the process of immanent negation of capitalism by the complete destruction of the machinery of bourgeois state. In both cases, negation is the concentration of a process through which is achieved the complete destruction of an old world. It is this concentration which realizes the negative power of negation, the negativity of negation, and I name it destruction. I name subtraction the affirmative part of negation. For example, the new musical axioms which structure for Schoenberg the admissible succession of notes in a musical work outside the tonal system are in no way deducible from the destruction of this system. They are the affirmative laws of a new framework for the musical activity. They show the possibility of a new consistency for musical discourse. The point that we must understand is that this new consistency is not new because it achieves the process of destruction of the system. The new consistency is new to the extent that, in the framework that the Schoenberg's axioms impose, the musical discourse avoids the laws of tonality, or, more precisely, becomes indifferent to these laws. That is why we can say that the musical discourse is subtracted from its tonal legislation. Clearly, this subtraction is in the horizon of negation, but it exists apart from the purely negative part of negation. It exists apart from destruction. It is the same thing for Marx in the political context. Marx insists on saying that the destruction of the bourgeois state is not in itself an achievement. The goal is communism. That is the end of the state as such, and the end of social classes in favor of a purely egalitarian organization of the civil society. But to come to this, we must first substitute to the bourgeois state a new state, which is not the immediate result of the destruction of the first. In fact, it is a state as different of the bourgeois state as the experimental music of today can be of an academic representation of Olympic gods. For the new state, that Marx names dictatorship of the proletariat, is a state which organizes its own vanishing, a state which is in its very essence the process of the non-state. Perhaps as for Adorno, the informal music is the process, in a work, of the destruction of all forms. So we can say that in the original thought of Marx, dictatorship of the proletariat was a name for a state which is subtracted from all classical laws of a normal state. For a classical state is a form of power, but the state named by Marx, dictatorship of proletariat, is the power of unpower, the power of the disappearance of the question of power. In any case, we name subtraction this part of negation which is oriented by the possibility of something which exists absolutely apart from what exists under the laws of what negation negates. So, negation is always, in its concrete action, political or artistic, suspended between destruction and subtraction. That the very essence of negation is destruction has been the fundamental idea of the last century. The fundamental idea of the beginning century must be that the very essence of negation is subtraction. But subtraction is not the negation of destruction, no more than destruction has been the negation of subtraction, as we have seen with Schoenberg or Marx. The most difficult question is precisely to maintain the complete concept of negation from the point of view of subtraction. As Lenin, Schoenberg, or Marcel Duchamp, or Cage, or Mao Zedong, or Jackson Pollock have maintained the complete concept of negation from the point of view of destruction. To clarify the very complex interplay between destruction, negation, and subtraction, I propose to read with you a fragment of a magnificent poem of Pier Paolo Pasolini. Pasolini is well known as a filmmaker. In particular, as you know, he has directed during the 60s and the 70s profound contemporary visual readings of the two great Western intellectual traditions, the ancient Greeks, with movies like Medea and Oedipus, and the Judeo-Christianity with the Gospel according to Matthew, and a very complex script about the life of St. Paul. All that constitutes a difficult thinking of the relationship between history, myths, and religion. Pasolini was simultaneously a revolutionary Marxist and a man forever influenced by his religious childhood. So his question was, is the revolutionary becoming of history, the political negativity, a destruction of the tragic beauty of the Greek myth and of the peaceful promise of Christianity? Or do we have to speak of a subtraction where an affirmative reconciliation of beauty and peace becomes possible in a new egalitarian world? Pasolini is also well known for the relationship between his private life and his public convictions. Not only he was gay, but this was a part of his political vision. Many years before the beginning of the gay and lesbian movement. he perfectly knew that the desire, and in its own case, the desire for young poor workers of the suburbs of Rome, is not independent of our ideological choices. Once more, the question is to inscribe sexual desire in the political negativity, not as a purely subversive and destructive feature, but as a creative displacement of the line which separates the individual subjectivity from the collective one. Pasolini has been murdered in November 1975. He was 53 years old. The circumstances of this horrible murder are still obscure today. But certainly, they are exactly at the point where political determinations are linked with sexual situations. It is this point which has been for Pasolini a constant source of new truths, but also an existential tragedy. Marvelous movies, political commitments, critical essays, great novels, new existential style. Beyond all that, Pasolini is the greatest poet of his generation. We can distinguish three major poetical collections. First, the poems written when Pasolini was 20 years old in a specific Italian dialect, the Friulan one. Here we have the attempt to subtract poetry to the authority of official Italian language and to use a popular language against the state language. It is a characteristic example of what Deleuze names minoritarian politics in poetry. Two, the great collection published in 1957, the heart of which is the magnificent poem The Ashes of Gramsci, a complex meditation concerning history, Marxist ideology, Italian landscape, and personal feeling. The title is in itself a metaphor of melancholic negation. Gramsci, the master, the father of Italian Marxism, is here like dissipated in the history's dust. Three, the two collections of the beginning of the 60s, The Religion of My Time in 1961, and Poetry in Form of a Rose in 1964. We have here the context of the fragment I shall explain today. Fundamentally, it is the bitter disappointment of Pasolini concerning the practices of the Italian left. And more precisely, two very serious failures of the Communist Party. First, an infidelity to the armed struggle of thousands of young men against fascism and Nazism during the war. Second, the Communist Party is unable to organize the revolt of thousands of young workers in the suburbs of Italian towns. So, we have here a double negation of popular young people. In the past, where their fighting is forgotten. In the present, where their revolt is despised. Pasolini has two very important reasons for being passionately interested in the existence and the struggles of young people. First, his younger brother, Guido, has been killed in fighting during the war as a resistant fighter. And the terrible problem is that he has been killed not by fascists, but by communists of another country, Yugoslavian communists, because of the rivalry between Italians and Yugoslavians concerning the control of some border regions. Second, as a gay, Pasolini has always had real and constant relationship with very poor young workers or with unemployed of the suburbs. That is why many poems of Pasolini speak of the contradiction between history, politics, and concrete existence of proletarian youth. We shall first listen to one of these poems. It is a fragment, a simple fragment of a very long poem, the title of which is Vittoria, Victory. Let us hear the original Italian version. Sorry.
Ogni politica è una realpolitik, anima guerriera con la tua delicata rabbia. Non riconosci un'altra anima, è questa dove c'è tutta la prosa dell'uomo abile, del rivoluzionario attaccato all'onesta media dell'uomo, anche la complicità con gli assassini degli anni amari si innesta nel classicismo protettore che fa il comunista per bene. Non riconosci il cuore che diventa schiavo del suo nemico e va dove il nemico va, condotto dalla storia che è storia di tutti e due e li fa nel profondo stranamente fratelli. Non riconosci i timori di una coscienza che, lottando col mondo, ne condivide le norme della lotta dei secoli, come per un pessimismo in cui affondano, per farsi più virili le speranze. Lieto di una lietezza che non sa retroscena, è questo esercito, cieco nel cieco sole, di giovani morti, che viene ed aspetta. Se il suo padre, il suo capo, lo lascia solo nei bianchi monti, nelle serene pianure, assorbito in un misterioso dibattito col potere, legato alla sua dialettica che la storia rinnova senza pace. Piano piano, dentro i barbarici petti dei figli, l'odio si fa amore per l'odio, lardendo solo in essi, i pochi, i benedetti. Ah, disperazione che non conosci i codici, ah, anarchia, libero amore di santità, con i tuoi canti prodi.
To have an overview of this fragment, we can say something like that. Everybody is saying that politics must be realistic, that all ideological illusions have been proved dangerous and bloody. But what is the real for politics? The real is history. The real is the concrete becoming of struggle and negation. But how is it possible to understand or know history? We can do that if we know the rules of history, the great laws of becoming. It is the lesson of Marxism. But are not the laws of history the same for us and for our enemies? And if it is the case, how can negation be distinguished from approval? We are in the situation where destruction being suppressed, the subtraction itself, the opposition, if you want, becomes complicity. as Pasolini writes, we recognize that we are going exactly where the enemy goes, led by a history that is the history of both. And political hope is impossible. So, if the young dead of the last war could see the present political situation, they would not agree with this complicity. Finally, they cannot accept their political fathers, the leaders of Communist Party, and they become, by necessity, barbarian and nihilistic people, exactly like the young unemployed of the suburbs. I shall read now the poem in French. The translation is by José Guidi. Pas de politique sans réalisme, âme guerrière, avec ta délicate rage. Ne reconnais-tu pas une autre âme? Allons donc, celle où il y a toute la prose de l'homme habile, du révolutionnaire qui s'attache à l'honnête homme moyen. Même la complicité avec les assassinats des années amères se greffe sur le classicisme protecteur qui caractérise le communiste comme il faut. Ne reconnais-tu pas le cœur qui se fait l'esclave de son ennemi, qui va là où l'ennemi va, sous la conduite de l'histoire qui est leur histoire à tous deux, et qui les rend au fond étrangement pareils? Ne reconnais-tu pas les craintes d'une conscience qui, luttant contre le monde, enregistre les règles de cette lutte au cours des siècles, comme sous l'effet d'un pessimisme où sombre pour y tremper sa virilité l'espérance, joyeuse d'une joie qui renie toute arrière-pensée, et cette armée, aveugle dans l'aveugle soleil, de jeunes morts qui viennent et qui attendent. Si leur père, leur chef, les laisse seuls dans la blancheur des monts, dans les paisibles plaines, absorbés en un mystérieux débat avec le pouvoir, enchaînés à sa dialectique que l'histoire l'oblige à réformer sans trêve, tout doucement, dans les cœurs barbares des fils, la haine fait place à l'amour de la haine, ne brûlant plus qu'en eux, peu nombreux, les élus. Ah, désespoir qui ignore les codes. Ah, anarchie, libre amour de sainteté avec tes chants altiers. This poem is a manifesto for true negation. If subtraction is separated from destruction, we have as result hate and despair. The symbol of this result is the fusion of the dead heroes of the last war with the despised workers of our suburbs in a sort of terrorist figure. But if destruction is separated from subtraction, we have as result the impossibility of politics, because young people are absorbed in a sort of nihilistic collective suicide, which is without thinking and destination. In the first case, fathers, it's the word of Pasolini, in the first case, fathers who are responsible for the emancipatory political orientation abandon their sons on behalf of the real. In the second case, sons, which are the collective strength of a possible revolt, abandon their fathers on behalf of despair. But emancipatory politics is possible only when some fathers and mothers and some sons and daughters are allied in an effective negation of the world as it is. With all that in mind, we can now read the poem in English. The translation is by Norman McAfee.
Victory. All politics is realpolitik, warring so with your delicate anger. You do not recognize a soul other than this one, which has all the prose of the clever man, l'homme habile, of the revolutionary devoted to the honest common man, even the complicity with the assassins of the bitter years grafted onto protector classicism, which makes the communist respectable. You do not recognize the heart that becomes slave to its enemy and goes where the enemy goes, led by a history that is the history of both, and makes them deep down, perversely, brothers. In French, brothers was effaced for pareil. You do not recognize the fears of a consciousness that, by struggling with the world, shares the rules of the struggle over the centuries, as through a pessimism into which hopes drown to become more virile. Joyous with a joy that knows no hidden agenda, this army, blind in the blind sunlight, of dead young men, comes and waits. If their father, their leader, absorbed in a mysterious debate with power, and bound by its dialectics, which history renews ceaselessly, if he abandons them in the white mountains, on the serene plains, piano, piano, tout doucement, little by little, in the barbaric breasts of the sons, hate becomes love of hate, burning only in them, the few, the chosen. Ah, desperation that knows no laws. Ah, anarchy, free love of holiness with your valiant songs.
The whole beginning of the poem, under the idea of realpolitik, or politik has to be realistic, we have something like negation without destruction. Realpolitik is something like that, the proposition of a negation without destruction. You can define this opposition. Opposition, in fact, is always negation without destruction. In the common democratic sense, like Democrats against Bush, or in France, Socialist Party against Sarkozy. We find in the poem two excellent definitions of this sort of negation. First, the prose of the clever man. The prose of the clever man. At the place, maybe, of the poetry of the revolt. Not the poetry of the revolt, but the prose of the clever man. And after that, protector classicism. Protector classicism. That is definition of negation without destruction, of opposition. And you will note that in both cases, the comparison is with artistic conservative style. Is something like academic style in politics. The bitter years are the years of the war, for Pasolini, which has been also largely, as you know, in Italy, a civil war between communists and fascists and so It's also the years of the tragic death of the young brother of Pasolini, the bitter years. And opposition, negation without destruction, is something like to forget the bitter years, to don't have a true relationship to the bitter years. The hurt of opposition, subtraction without destruction, or negation without destruction, is to substitute some rules to the violence of the real. No violence of the real at all, but always rules. I can say to substitute rules of history, rules of economy, to the rupture of an event. And when you do that, when you substitute rules to the violence of the real, you, I quote Pasolini, you share the rules of the struggle with your enemy. You have the same rules as your enemy. And finally, you become, I quote a very strong formula, you become slave of your enemy. You are under the law of your enemy because you have the same rules. You become a brother of your enemy. So, opposition, in the classical democratic sense, is in fact for Pasolini the death of negation. And it is the death of political order, of historical order. In this context, Pasolini has a sort of magnificent and melancholic vision. The army of dead young men of the last war, and among them certainly his younger brother Guido, is coming to see their father, their leader. That is in fact the revolutionary leaders of today, the direction of the Communist Party, or something like that. This army is, I quote, blind in the blind sunlight. First, they don't see anything. They come and wait in the white mountains on the Syrian plains. And they see their father, their leader, finally. And they see him absorbed in the very weak form of negation. The very weak form of dialectical negation. This negation is without destruction. This negation is not apart from the power. It's not apart from the state. This negation is only, says Pasolini, an obscure relationship to the power itself. It is, I quote, a mysterious debate with power. A mysterious debate with power. It's another formula to describe democratic opposition. Mysterious debate with power. So, concludes the young man in the army of dead young men, so the father is in fact without freedom. He is bounded by the dialectics of power. The conclusion is that this father abandons them. Abandons them. You see the problem, which is clearly a problem of today. The army of dead young men was on the side of destruction, of hate. They existed on the hard side of negation. But they wait for an orientation, for a negation with, under some law, maybe some paternal law, reconciles destruction and subtraction. They wait for something like that, on the part of destruction. But contemporary leaders abandon them. So they have only the destructive part of negation for themselves. They have only, I quote, desperation that knows no laws at all. And the description of their subjectivity is quite an expressive one. Yes, they were on the side of hate, of destruction. They were angry young men. But now, it is a very striking formula. Hate becomes love of hate. This love of hate is negation as purely destructive. Without an access to subtraction, without fathers or leaders, we have to face the nudity of, I quote, the barbaric breasts of the sons. Greek poetry is always an anticipation, a vision of the collective future. We can see here that Pasolini describes the terrorist subjectivity. He indicates with an astonishing precision that the possibility of this subjectivity among young men or women is the lack of any rational hope of changing the world. That is why he creates a poetical equivalence at the end of the fragment. He creates a poetical equivalence between, first, desperation, the nihilistic consequence of false negation, when the domination is on the side of false negation, negation without destruction, we have nihilistic consequence, desperation, anarchy, the purely destructive political version, and, I quote, free love of holiness, which is the religious context of terrorism, with the figure of the martyr. This equivalence is certainly clearer today than it was 40 years ago when Pasolini wrote Victory. We can now conclude the political problems of the contemporary world cannot be solved, neither in the weak context of democratic opposition, which in fact abandons millions of people to a nihilistic destiny, nor in the mystical context of destructive negation, which is another form of power, the power of death. Neither subtraction without destruction, nor destruction without subtraction. It is in fact the problem of violence today. Violence is not, as has been said during the last century, the creative and revolutionary part of negation. The way of freedom, I think, is really a subtractive one. But to protect the subtraction itself, to defend the new kingdom of emancipatory politics, we cannot radically exclude all forms of violence. The future is not on the side of the savage young men and women of popular suburbs. We cannot abandon them to themselves. But the future is not on the side of the democratic wisdom of mothers and fathers' law. We have to learn something
of nihilistic subjectivity. The world is made not of law and order, but of law and desire. Let us learn from Pasolini not to be absorbed in a mysterious debate with power, not to abandon millions of young men and women, neither in the white mountains nor on the serene plain. We have to create something for everybody. Thank you.
Warum haben wir das Gedicht nicht auch auf Deutsch gehört? Why not in German too? You know? Why only this? Especially realpolitik, you know? It's not Italian. You know? It's not Marx either, it's Bismarck. It's Bismarck, the German Iron Chancellor. Yes. Also. Yes. My first comment, as you know, does not know people here. I have the right to comment as long as I want because I'm the director. Okay? It's power. Yes. First thing I note is that you should get in trouble tonight with Judith. Because what did you do today, right here, subordinating a poet to your political philosophy, even use every word of him like he was written in the theory.
It's an old polemic.
It's a problem. it's a problem. And the problem is even stronger because a text could be easily prose. There are only moments in it in which you see the poetry coming out. But it could be written in a newspaper if somehow, if you say, Pasolini, okay, a little bit crazy, why not using some fancy words? But in fact, make a statement. The point of poetry is that it faces you the riddle, if you want, the mystery of it. It is smarter and always smarter than you ever will be. So when you get into it, the surprises that it will not do and say what you like him to say. This will be there and you cannot erase it. That's why you cannot subordinate. You cannot erase it. You can be inspired. That is what you did on this. Okay. So I will not criticize it. I just want to make sure philosophers have to be very careful before they get near of poetry when they want to make an argument. But let's make the argument. There's an interesting idea to use this mathematical term, subtraction, abziehen. In fact, you remember, this is the first you learn, addition and subtraction. That's the first operation. And I must admit that's the only operation I understand in mathematics, and I'm not kidding. The rest, no idea. This one I can still understand and understand. So when I abziehen, when I take something away, still a lot is still there. It's not that everything is destroyed and everything. So there is something still. In some way, there is a realpolitik in there, which is not the Bismarck, but it's also Bismarck. Bismarck realpolitik was about making compromises, not win everything, so lose some, win some. That's realpolitik. But in subtraction, some of that is still there. You know, you take something away, some criticism you cannot, negation you cannot avoid, but life still goes on. Still something to hope for, something like that. And yes, and I think exactly we had this discussion before about celebrating life in life or celebrating death in life, things like that. We have to learn to deal with negation without throwing everything out and destroying everything and force life and death decision to us. Okay, I agree with that. But I ask, but there is something, in Marx, for example, when you don't, Marx, not the politician, not the economist, Marx, the philosopher, finally allowed to see again. His great idea was the Verwirklichung der Philosophie. Means philosophy is not there to stay. So our happy moments are if we can get more and more, not rid, but let it behind, abziehen, subtraction of the philosophical ideals, the big yes or no and right and wrong stuff, because life gets better and better. And at the end, we don't have philosophy because we live very well. And no reason to know more than understanding our living, no need for theory. That would be a subtraction. Okay, so that's my first point. My second point is anarchy. I'm not sure, and probably you're not sure here in this poem, is he in favor or not of anarchy? Is anarchy his love or not his love? Yes. My Pasolini, which might not be your Pasolini, but remember I lived at this time too, not only you have been there. Is he, Pasolini, he was in love with anarchy. He was the most anarchistic among the communists and whatever there, because at the time, nobody of you know that probably anymore, nobody believed in the 60s in communism anymore, except a few people in Slovenia. Because they had so disappointed us with their realen Sozialismus, with their realpolitik. So that, but still, it was not that we went to the other side. So the fact was, every time we came together in a bar, we created a new communist party. There were so many 10 new communist parties in Germany alone. But of course, everybody had an idea how to do that, and it was a mix of this style and Adorno and anarchy and everything, this kind of finding theory. And the attraction of anarchy was not the attraction of bombing. That was the anarchist of the 19th century, the Russian anarchist. Anarchy was nobody's master, nobody's slave. Not about just nobody's slave, so also nobody's master. That was actually the real attraction. And I'm an anarchist. You are not my slaves, but I'm not your master, and it's the other way around, you know. I don't care what you do or not do. That's the freedom in there. So you can have coalition and agreement and real life and etc. and building something like that, but it does not have to be protected by the power structure itself. And that, I think, is the political, might be the political, not dream, also the reality of Pasolini. And that's just the last remark, because we did not believe in communists, all thinkers at the 60s and early 70s looked for, is there another power there? And usually, they went to the students. Oh, students movement, Marcuse, that is a power. Let's look at the students. You are no power. That was an illusion. Also, you might be what's that? Something helping. Ferment. That's the word for that. The student movement was important in cultural terms, etc. But it was not the power you could look for. And it's the same here, the Italian proletarian, which later turned into the Red Brigades and things like that. They were just nuisance. And their power was, as a political nuisance, their power was cultural, yes, but never political. So, let's start the discussion, yes.
Okay. Last year you spoke of action without a place, and I'm still thinking about that phrase. Would you say that the subtractive act is action without a place? So is your position now that we need both action with a place, which I'm reading as destruction, and action without a place, i.e. subtraction?
Last year, l'année dernière, tu as parlé de l'action sans place.
Ah oui, yes. Just Your question, I don't forget at all your question, but I have something to say to Wolfgang. on two little points. First, about the relationship between philosophy and poetry. And philosophy, you say, has to be cautious in its relationship to poetry. But poetry is not a weak woman. Why to be cautious? I am not cautious at all with poetry. I think poetry, my idea is that great poets are certainly stronger than me. So I am not cautious, not in a defensive manner, not in an offensive manner. When I use poetry, it's certainly for myself. And why not? Why not? Why not? There is no canonic or official use of poetry. Poetry is some text, and I can use them as I want. There is no problem at all. And certainly, this sort of use is to capture, to size something of the strength of poetry. For what? For philosophy. It's an appropriation, a good appropriation. I played guilty. It's not my relationship to poetry is not the relationship of a critic or of a professor of literature or something like that. My relation to poetry is the relationship of a philosopher, in fact, and it's not an aggressive position like the position of Plato. It's not a sort of religious relationship, like the relationship of Heidegger. Oh, the poems, the poets, and so on. No, poets and poems are my friends. And with a friend, you have conversation, and hard conversation is a necessity. But you are not cautious and so on. It's the first point. And the second point is concerning subtraction. Subtraction cannot be separated from destruction. That is the point. There is no possibility of subtraction alone because, and it's the idea of Pasolini himself, subtraction alone is in fact complicity with the enemy, is in fact acceptation of the same rules. So subtraction is not something which is an other way in regard to destruction, but destruction and subtraction as two components, two elements of true negation. True negation, true critics, if you want, are always something like a mixture of destruction and subtraction. All the problem is to say that today, for a great number of reasons, in the dialectic between destruction and subtraction, probably we have to pay attention to the importance of subtraction. But subtraction, what is today the most important enemy? Is there really destruction? No. In the Western world, the most important enemy is negation of negation, is something like we are all under the same rules. It's democracy in the ordinary sense, pools and so on. with two parties which finally are the same, as exactly Pasolini said, you become the same as your enemy. That is, in our world today, the most important difficulty for a new politics. And so, first, we have to say that subtraction in its composition with destruction is very important. But second, we have also to say that subtraction without destruction is not negation at all. And finally, is something like complicity. It was only these 2 points. Now for the question. When I speak of politics without place, I speak of the idea that there is in the objectivity of the world, there is nothing which prescribes really a political orientation. It was not the same thing in the last century, because in the last century we have the classical Marxism, which says that there are classes, and classes are political agents, and so we have the party of the workers and the party of the bourgeois state, and so on. And so we have places, objective places, which determine, finally, the political orientation. I think the situation today is much more complex. There is no clear distinction of places or fixed places which are determination for political orientation. So we have to find an orientation without places. There is something which is pure determination or political determination without the support of a clear organization of objectivity. And so we cannot say that politics is a sort of representation of the social realities. Politics is the relationship between the society in general and politics is different. To find a new political way is not immediately dependent from objective analysis. Oui. I think there is a relationship, in fact, because the idea of subtraction as one side of the negation is also to say that we have to find a new form of destruction, maybe the divine destruction, or the divine violence, or the divine destruction, but a new concept of violence. The general idea, I think, is that violence is justified when we have to protect something really new in the political field. So we cannot exclude the use of defensive violence, because the subtractive part is also a construction. It's something, it's the affirmative part of negation. But when you create something like that, you have always under the risk of its destruction by the enemies, because the negation is always here, not only on your side, but on the other side too. So the invention of a new form of violence is to construct progressively the means to protect the affirmation itself. So the relationship between subtraction and destruction is finally to substitute a defensive vision of violence to the idea of attack, revolution, insurrection, destruction, and so on. You have an affirmative construction, but you have to protect the affirmation. Yes? Oui, oui.
You said we cannot exclude all forms of violence. In mathematics, subtraction remains undefined for infinite pairs in the category of natural numbers. So, do you propose that we leave out in ontology natural numbers, or perhaps in Pasolini's words, the White Mountains, the
You interpret subtraction too literally. It's an image. Subtraction is, as Wolfgang was saying, it's a mathematical image. By subtraction, we have to understand a process which creates something new, which is subtracted from the dominant laws of the situation. Okay? Subtraction is only this point. Something is created by political action, artistic creation, what you want, which is not under the dominant laws of the situation. That is the subtraction properly. So something which is retired from the domination. And so it's not in contradiction with the ontology of numbers and so on. It's only to take the image of subtraction, precisely, to define something in the concrete process of political action. Yes, yes. And
Thanks for your talk. I have two questions, so I'll make the first one short. First is, I think you said the goal of Marxism is to have a purely egalitarian organization of society. So the first question is, do you agree that the drive for purity is the core of totalitarianism?
do you agree with that?
Did you say totalitarian? The drive for purity.
And then
Totalitarian.
The question of the possibility of a more egalitarian society, or finally a true egalitarian society, is not by necessity in relationship to the question of purity. When I say egalitarian society or purely egalitarian society, it's at the level of a principle. The principle, the big idea is to create the possibility of an egalitarian society. But we know that nothing is pure in the world. So we know that there is always differences between the idea as such, egalitarian society, and the process, the concrete process of equality. And so I think it's not the history of a communist state in Soviet Union, for example, is not a question of purity. I don't think at all. It's the question of organization of the state. It's a question of power. It's a question of organization of the power after the revolution. And it's a concrete question of the state, and it's not an ideological question of purity. Purity is an effect of the struggles inside the new society. but it's not the concept of the difficulty.
So my second question was, it seems, I guess, do you agree that one of the big problems with conceiving of politics as dialectics is this idea of false security, of like creating an idea of the revolutionary and the enemy, and then trying to create a distinct. I mean, like you said.
I don't think that it was the most important difficulty, you see. Certainly, it was not the question of purity, it was much more the question of the possibility of creation by destruction. The idea of the destruction as the affirmation itself, that the destructive part of negation as creative by itself. Or in fact, destruction is not creative by itself. Certainly, as said Mao Zedong, without destruction, no construction. It's true, but it's different to say with destruction we have construction. And so the relationship in the revolutionary context between the negativity, the negative part of negation, the destruction, and the idea that when the state of the enemy is destroyed and so on, something new appears, it's a false idea. Because we have destruction really, but destruction is not by itself the creation of something new. And it was my example of Schoenberg or Marx or many others. We can see concretely that the process of affirmation has always something which is independent of the process of destruction. So, but you know, we have to find a way which affirms that something new cannot be created only by destruction, but which affirms also that destruction is a part of negation. Oui?
I wanted to thank you for the very elegant delivery of your paper, and to ask a question that might be too simple, but it strikes me. I wanted to know if you agree that students have no power, and if so, what? What should our power be, and what would we do to achieve it?
I agree with students alone have no big power. So if you want something like a new power, but maybe politics today is not precisely to want immediately a new power, it's another discussion. But if you want power, we have to find some resource, some strengths, not in the students themselves, but in the rest of the population. Because finally, which decides in politics are masses of workers, ordinary citizens, and so on. They decide really in the field of emancipatory politics. So the necessity for the students is to create relationship to non-students, to workers. That is the great problem in every country. And you know, when we have a great sequence of politics, when we have something which is really new, we have always some attempts and sometimes some facts which are in the direction of relationship, strong relationship between intellectual, students, workers, and so on. It's a great principle of politics today. We cannot do anything without new relationships, new relations between all the possible components of the political movement. And but it's not easy. It's work. It's a great work. Yes.
You didn't feel that, for example, a while back ago, the students protesting the labor law with Premier Vildepin, the May 1968 student revolts, that it was a negative expression, but at the same time, there were a number of administrative reforms that took place after these demonstrations.
Yes, I know, but I don't deny, I don't negate the importance of the movement of students. And in May '68, it was certainly something of great importance. I only say that movement of students cannot create completely new political conditions. What creates new political conditions is always new relationships between, for example, students or intellectuals and other parts of population. That is really the key. That is the key. And it's the difficulty, the real difficulty, but it's also the definition of politics today. The new relationship between intellectual students and other parts of the civil society, certainly. And so it's also the question of new forms of organization, because we cannot have something new in the field of relationship between the students, intellectual, and workers, and so on, without new forms of organization. It cannot be trade unions, because trade unions separate, in fact, and it cannot be the whole parties, because the whole parties, finally, are exactly like in the poem of Pasolini. They are under the same rules. And so we have to create new forms of intervention, of protest, and of organization. And we are absolutely at the beginning of this process. Historically, we are at the beginning. Something is finished. Something is finished. And all idea of revolution is finished, is closed, certainly. And precisely, the dialectical idea of creation by negativity. And the Revolutionary Party was party of negation, of destruction. They have no idea, in fact, of the new. It is why the state which has been created in Soviet Union was so bad. It was, in fact, a sad repetition of all the bad aspects of the state. Because destruction cannot create a new state. Revolution cannot create a new state. So we have to create something new. And all the sequence of the last century, with revolution, parties, classes, etc., all that is finished. All that is closed. And so we are in a new beginning. We are in the beginning of politics. And it's marvelous to begin.
Okay, everything depends on what we understand. We have to be very precise by destruction, by violence. The first rule is let's not be too fascinated by what we perceive as so-called, what I tend to call subjective violence. We have a clear agent who does it. For me, the paradox of today's capitalism is that So, along these lines, what I am missing in that the space outlined by the poem by Badiou is as if we have there the space of law, loss of history, law and order, and then the problem of revolutionary oppositional forces is either you become one of them, accept the rules, the laws of history, or you step out. The only choice for these young people and this crazy anarchy, love of hate, and so on. And of course, the idea is how to unite the two. But the first thing what I would have done is to deny that what these students are, or anybody, while young workers are opposing. Law is not only law. Law is already in itself sustained by a breathtaking, brutal violence. From wars to whatever you want. So the first thing I would say is that it's not only a question for us, it's already the system itself which unites law and extreme disorder. In this sense, the problem is, for me, I would put it of destruction, violence, not only either totally opposing, destroying, or just an opposition, but how even what may appear as a radical, brutal negation violence is co-opted. So this is for me the problem of inventing new violence, because if we understand violence in not in this subjectively fascinated sense, whether shooting, whatever bombing, but violence as the brutal, true change of fundamental relations in politics, sorry, in society, then I'm tempted to claim, I know this will sound crazy, maybe some will be offended, that the problem with somebody like Hitler was that he wasn't violent enough. It is easy to show how all his murdering the Jews, whatever, was a kind of a supplementary weak action avoiding to confront the true enemy, to change just a little bit capital relations society. And you be tempted to go a step further. With Stalinism is the same. It's clear that the great Stalinist purges were basically acts of impotence, of panic, as you would have said, of the failure to invent something new. So I think the problem is not in these abstract terms, too much violence or more. The problem is elsewhere. So now let's do clarifying questions based on this. First one, probably you would, to me, here maybe this is a tiny difference between us. The question of determinate negation. You would probably put determinate negation into that category of old revolutions of 19th century, which thought that negation as such will, as it were, produce its own determination, its own positive content. But I think this category, I would be more optimistic, can be interpreted that the way to bring together isn't destruction, it rejoins with subtraction. I don't think we should maybe drop the category of determinate negation so quickly. And the last point, I like that words by Pasolini, hate. Every revolutionary needs hate. Don't deprive me of hate, then I don't know what to do. But then it shouldn't change into love of hate. What then is the role of love? I am here opting for Kierkegaard. Hatred, the formula is not love of hate, but hate out of love. I don't think this is a hypocritical paradox. I think every authentic revolutionary takes this position. Do you agree or you find this problem?
Just on one point, and after that we discuss all the night. If I agree with the idea that violence is in fact inscribed in the objective situation and cannot be reduced to subjective violence. We know perfectly that probably the situation today is a very violent one, and probably we can say that the situation is a situation of war, in fact, at the geopolitical level, situation of war. It's, in fact, the idea of Bush, a long war, a long war against terrorism. But in fact, many wars and for a long time. So certainly violence is in objective, exists in an objective fashion and not only in a subjective one. But this signifies that violence, this violence, is something like a law of the situation itself, okay? So if subtraction is to be as such as possible outside the laws of the situation, we have not to be in this violence as such, because it's a part of the situation, precisely. Yeah? And it is my critique of terrorism, finally. I think that terrorism itself is a part of the violence of the situation and not something which is outside the laws of the situation. So there is something like a common vision of the world inscribed in the structure of the contemporary capitalism and all the form of states, and on the side of terrorism too. And it is because, and it's present in the poem of Pasolini, because finally the appearance of common rules, the appearance of complicity between the different parts of the political society and the violence in the oppressive side and in this terrorist figure are all the same phenomenon. And it is why we cannot begin by violence. We cannot begin by violence. I think we have to begin in another manner. Because if we begin by violence, we are in fact in the law of the situation itself. And it's the way of terrorism today, to begin by violence. You demonstrate your existence by violence. But finally, it's a part of the becoming of the system itself. And so if we have to find a new form of politics, certainly they don't begin by new form of violence. New form of violence is another problem, is how we can protect the little part of the situation which is not completely under the laws, under the dominant laws of the society, and in fact under the laws of violence too. And we have some experience in this direction, experience of the violence which is only the possibility of violence, a violence which is something like a virtual violence. At the beginning, for example, of the Zapatist movement in Mexico, we have something like that. They are armed, they can fight, but they don't fight. Yeah? They only say, if we attack us, we are armed and we can defend our position. But we don't fight, we don't want to fight. There has been something also like that in the first sequence of the movement in Poland, at the end of the communist, the workers were organized and they say, we don't want attack the power. We want to construct a new position and a new possibility of discussion with the power. We don't attack the power. So there is a story of all that, and the story of all that is the story of the new politics and the relationship in the new politics between destruction and subtraction. As named subtraction, I insist, a part of negation, not something which can be separated of the movement of negation. We stop here.
Yes.